Hello, everyone. It is 1 o'clock, and we have an audience, we have a speaker, we have popcorn. I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to say welcome to the April event on ARCH's 2023 Fun and Free Lecture Series. My name is Connie Haas-Zuber. I am the Executive Director of ARCH, and I am very proud to have these events to present to the city of Fort Wayne and the community of Northeast Indiana. I want to note that today is a special lecture event because we do have a sponsor for this particular lecture, because it turns out Fort Wayne, just in the past couple of weeks, has a mid-century modern shop where you can find home decor items and furniture items from this wonderful and fascinating period of time. We have a tiny little display behind me here that you can take a look at. The shop name is the 6040s, and proprietor Lee Bender at 1507 Spy Run has sponsored the cost for this particular event, and he is open this afternoon if you want to go visit the shop and take a look at what's there. This particular chair is a Gaston Rinaldi Italian, one of a pair of mid-century modern chairs. That are just two of the amazing things he has in his shop. Combination of decor and furniture as I looked at it yesterday. I think it's neat that Fort Wayne has this, because we didn't used to have this, because people I know who were interested couldn't find things, but now you can. And you have a knowledgeable person to talk to about it who also knows what other shops have, and we'll talk to you about that. So he can help you find things. So thank you very much to Lee Bender and the 6040s for sponsoring this event. ARCH's lecture series is ARCH's gift of education to the community. It is made possible by the volunteers and members and donors of ARCH who support our operations and staff. And this year's lecture series is also supported by funding from Arts United of Greater Fort Wayne, the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne, and Indiana Humanities. You were all given a little handout with a QR code on it, very important, because we are inviting you to become an ARCH member and donor to support this program and all that ARCH and its historic preservation work contributes to community well-being in Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana. We think of it as investing in history for our future, because that's what this kind of work does. I will note that we are also eager to hear your reviews of this program and your ideas for what ARCH could be doing to make an even bigger impact. So let's talk in person today, by phone or email. Our website address is on here. You can go there and find all the other information and email addresses and stuff you might need to do that. So right now, I'm going to turn the event over to our speaker for the day, because that's who you're here for. You get to sit through the commercial, but that's why you're able to be here, because ARCH is doing this. Today's topic is mid-century modern in Fort Wayne, and our speaker is architect Dodd Kattman, who is ARCH's immediate past board president, and I know him to be an aficionado of all things architecturally modern, so he will have plenty to say, and I've seen the pictures he's using today. Fascinating, informative. We could be here all day plus to talk about this. We will learn a lot, so listen to what he says, look at all the pictures he found for us to see, learn, and feel free to ask questions. Dodd, I turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Connie. Thank you all for being here. It's such a lovely day, and I'm so happy that you're here with us. We're better as a team. This is, I knew walking into this was a very dangerous presentation, because mid-century modern design is very hot right now. All you have to do is walk into my house, and it looks like a museum to Eames and Saarinen and all of these people. And everybody has an opinion on what that means. So one of the things that I do not want to do is focus on what's in that bucket of so-called mid-century modern architecture and what's outside of that bucket, because that's not how real world works. You go through architectural history courses and you learn that this happened in this style, and then this happened and this happened, and it's very cut and dry and it's very rational. But I think we all know that's not how people think, that's not how designers think. So part of my goal is to share with you some opinions on what mid-century modern architecture means. And we also have some cool local examples. I might also guarantee I probably don't have the one that's coming to your mind, so apologies in advance, no profanities, they're taping this. So I want to give a shout out. Krager with the local HPC is always so helpful when we're doing research, and he was helpful, as is Arch. Connie's been helpful. And Cody Sprunger from the Andrew Seeger Archives for the Built Environment at Ball State University, he was going to try to come up today. He couldn't make it. They have a wonderful archive in Muncie, and he shared some great examples and images of some local buildings you might be familiar with, but probably haven't seen the images. So special shout out to those. So if you look at, I don't know, whatever online, Wikipedia, whatever it might be, they're going to say mid-century modern was a subset of modern architecture. It started in 1945 and it ended about 1975. It's very, again, cut and dry, very simple. I don't think it's that simple. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is go on a monologue of some things that I think are helpful to help understand where it came from. And I think will also help share why some of the local examples are really important examples of that style. And I'm going to divide it between pre-World War II and post-World War II, because I think that is a really sharp edge. One of the first discussions that Connie and I had is, and I guess I presented this, and it was almost facetious, but saying, you know what, if it weren't for the Saarinens and the Eames and the Nelsons and the Bertoyas and the Breuers and all of the people who designed this furniture, would there ever have been a mid-century modern style of architecture defined? Or would it just blended into something called modern architecture in the United States? So one of the things that's fun when you see a lot of these images, probably one of these pieces of furniture is in every one of the examples. It's crazy how consistent people were who decorated their homes. But if we say that all this is mid-century, there's something wrong here, because these three pieces of iconic furniture were designed in the 20s. That doesn't fit into the post-World War span. So that's where, again, I think it gets especially interesting to start looking at what was going on in Europe, and things like Hitler's regime did more to advance the arts and architecture design in the United States than we might be aware. So if we go back into that period of the late 20s, this international style of architecture in Europe was catching a lot of wind, and people like Corbu, who designed this Villa Savoie, this got a lot of attention and still gets a lot of attention in history books as a real iconic building to support this international style. This is an image of the interior of that same, so you see a lot of reduction of ornamentation, of exposed steel. You'll see a lot of concrete, a lot of large glass spans. So some of this international style really became, I think, one of the instigators to mid-century modern architecture, which is a very United States, what would I call it? I guess style. It's something we can really own, like NASCAR and country music. I mean, this is ours. This belongs to the United States. And staying back in this early to mid 20th century period, you've all heard about the Bauhaus in Germany. It had moved from a couple different sites. And if you look at some of the Bauhaus, if you're not familiar with it, was this, I'll call it a college. It was somewhat like a college of art, all arts and design, including architecture, fabric, three-dimensional sculpture, painting, whatever it might be. And if you look at this is a group of faculty members there at one time. If you look at the names that were there, Albers, Mahali Naji, Baer, just going through Breuer, Kandinsky, Clay. I mean, Gunther Stoltz was an amazing fabric artist. If you look at the modern art that sells for 7+ figures in the United States, it came from a lot of these people who were all at the Bauhaus. In Germany, the Bauhaus was a very experimental school, and they were known for really having crazy parties and really pushing the limits of arts. The Hitler regime caught on to this and shut it down. This did not represent Hitler's view of German exceptionalism. So, and because of that, a lot of those artists, several of the artists that you saw represented, emigrated to the United States. So we were all the beneficiaries of that, including Walter Gropius, who is the director of the Bauhaus for a period of time. He came to the United States, and I can't recall, I think he was the dean of the architecture school, I believe at Harvard, but I think he also had some connections at Yale too, and I can't remember where he spent more time. So he designed this house for himself to stake a flag in the ground and say, this is where design is going, this international style. This is what we should be thinking about in the United States from a style of architecture. So because I'm childish and because I grew up on the southeast part of Fort Wayne, does anybody recognize this place? When I had the hardest time finding images of this, and so there was a department store off of 27, and I think it was Hannah, maybe called Mr. Wiggs. Back behind there, in the middle of nowhere, was this house. And when I was growing up, this would have been, oh my goodness, this would have been the early to mid 70s. When I was, 11 or 12 years old and collecting beer cans. Kids did that. I mean, who would let their 6th grader collect beer cans? That seems so odd, but my parents allowed that. And this was a place that was run down. It was away from all the public view, and it was full of vandalism, and it was just almost a shell of a building. This is what the Jacob Nee House. Jacob Nee was a superintendent for an organization that I think was called the Suburban Building Company Corporation, something like that. They were the construction company that built a lot of the houses in Indian Village. So to get a feeling for that era of architecture. So when Jacob was not overseeing homes being built in Indian Village, in his spare time, along with his wife, along with his 2 sons, they took on designing this international style you could wrap a lot of styles into this, certainly this streamlined version of architecture, to build this country home on the southeast portion of town. And I was always so fascinated with it. And there's more stories about this house that aren't true than there is information that is. And Cody was really helpful digging these out of the archives at Ball State, which I later found out, and I should have gone to him first. Craig had done a research project on this when he was at Ball State and probably knew everything about this thing. So as all things historic in Northeast Indiana, I should have just called Craig first. So the story is that on weekends, they would all work on these things. They designed the house. They designed the formwork to cast these concrete blocks. It was all hand-built by their family. The 2 Nee children went off to World War II. Project went on hold. They came back. I think one of the daughters and son-in-laws, or perhaps I think it was a daughter and son-in-law, moved to Florida. Jacob Nee went down to see him, had a heart attack, died. The sons thought they would pick up the construction and finish it over the next number of years, which is why you see the year of here, 38 to 51. That was the span of this thing when it was under construction. They never completed it. The house became just desolate, full of graffiti, and it ended up being sold to a developer who tore it down and built a lot of houses. So this is an article from the News Sentinel. We all called it the White Mansion. That's what we thought it was. So anyway, there's a lot of fascinating information, and Cody has a lot of this information, and so does Krager now. I sent him several links to this. knowing I'm going to need to keep up and knowing that there are more slides than I can share today, something else is happening on the west coast of the United States. This is a very famous house. Richard Neutra was a protege, worked for Frank Lloyd Wright in the early part of the 20th century, moved out to California, and was looking for a new style of architecture that enhanced health and well-being. And that's so interesting to me because our architectural practice is all in on health and well-being right now. And Richard Neutra was exploring these models back in 1929. So look at that. Is that mid-century modern architecture? I mean, I would argue it is. That was 1929. That was well before World War II. The idea was that plenty of light, plenty of open windows, fresh air, out in the country. It's just a healthier way of living. The other interesting thing about this house is, well, I'll keep this to me for right now. I'll share with you later. And it relates to this one. I would not call this mid-century modern architecture. This is a fabulous house that's been called Falling Water in, I think the name of the town is Ohiopyle, Pennsylvania, in western rural Pennsylvania. It's built on top of a stream, and there was a Kaufman family in downtown Pittsburgh. They had a huge department store, big advocates of the arts, advancing the arts. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is Mr. Kaufman, and this is Edgar Jr. Kaufman, his son on the left. So they did a lot within their department stores to advance art and architecture, and one of those relationships was committing to this house they built out in rural western Pennsylvania. They also saw this modern, because I think one of the things that is worth exploring as those early images of the furniture, mid-century modern design is probably heavier in furniture, arts, objects than it is in architecture. They were interested in selling the objects at their department store in Pittsburgh. So they were very daring with a lot of the projects, and their name's going to come up later on also. This is, I've been here before, and I've got a funny story I could share about this place, but I won't, and I can later on if anybody wants to stick around. Okay, one of the last things I'll talk about if we're isolating pre-World War II in the United States is, I think, to define mid-century modern, there are two camps. There's one camp that came out of Cranbrook, and there's another camp that came out of a lot of developers and architects on the West Coast. And there was a lot of cross-fertilization. So the short story here is there was a very wealthy couple in suburban Detroit, the Booth family, who wanted to start an art museum in suburban Detroit. Short time before that, a gentleman named Iljo Saarinen, who was becoming a very famous architect in Finland, he entered the Chicago Tribune design competition, got second place, was awarded $20,000, took that money and emigrated to the United States with his prize money. A couple years later, and through some connections at the University of Michigan, they were connected to George Booth, and Iljo Saarinen said, well, why are you designing a museum? Why not develop an academy to compete with, say, the Bauhaus, what the Bauhaus was back in the day? So they had enough money, and they said, why not? This is actually the Academy of Art, and we could go on and on and on about Cranbrook and the influence that Cranbrook had on this movement, and also on some architecture in Fort Wayne. But look at some of the people that were there in the early days of Cranbrook. So Iljo, who is the president of Cranbrook, and doing a lot of the architectural design on that campus, Eero Saarinen, and I hope you know the word Eero Saarinen, maybe the most famous international or national mid-century modern architects. That's him. The guy with the hat is Iljo. The guy to his left is his son. Charles and Ray Eames, many of you may know them more famously from their furniture, probably, than from their architecture, as well as Bertoia. Florence Knoll was an interior designer who ended up creating Knoll Group, and now, ironically, Knoll and Herman Miller are connected, so you can buy buy all your great mid-century furniture in one spot now. Harry Weiss, Ralph Sampson, these were all giants of that movement that all were connected there at Cranbrook. So one of the Cranbrook references, and maybe the last example I'll share pre-war, I don't want to go deep into this house. Many of you may be familiar with it because Arch had a tour and has a lot of information, I think, posted on the website, Connie, right? Maybe? Possibly. This is one of the best examples of mid-century modern architecture, I think, in the Midwest and definitely in the state of Indiana. The contractor who constructed quite a few of the buildings at Cranbrook had his office here in downtown Fort Wayne, and he convinced Iliel and Eero Saarinen to come and work to design his house. This is located, I think, just south of DeKalb County, up in northern Allen County. It's fabulous. Right now, it's an interior design office. Frank runs his offices out of these, and I know Karen's very familiar with Frank's work, and the family that owns this, or it might be in their foundation right now. So they're protecting the house, they're saving it, and Frank has a good eye and knows what to do to keep this house protected. These are some very early images that I believe came from the Cranbrook archives, and you can see the reason why I'm putting some nerdy floor plans in here is floor plans changed with a lot of these mid-century designs. You'll see a lot of open plans and a lot of large sculptural fireplaces and that help become room dividers rather than boxing a building up in several walls. These are a couple newer photographs, current photographs. This entertainment center that has, I believe this is an original painting. When the house was built, the back of it is really an entertainment center that I believe was influenced by Eames at that time. I may be wrong with that. But you can see the recessed living pit down there to the right, which this photo takes. Now, some of the furniture here isn't original, but you can get an idea how open and flowing this house is. It's a fabulous example. So World War II happens. Things don't go well for Europe. Things don't go well at all for Germany. And that made a big difference in the United States, because you can imagine a lot of these European giants, communities, cities who were the forefront of modern design now had a lot of rebuilding to do. Their economies weren't so robust. Our economy was doing pretty well after World War II. So some of the influences that I'll share that I think had a big impact on the development of this movement is post-war, we all know about this demand for homes that occurred in the United States. The United States economy was booming. We had money to spend and we had people making money in this country. And there were also a lot of technologies that were just now coming to age, like large panels of insulated glass were important to this movement. Prefabrication, steel being considered now as an element to build homes and not just wood or stone or brick. And there was a lot of new technology being introduced at this time with appliances and how to make your life easier. Air conditioning was starting to become more widespread. And the one thing I'll have you maybe keep in your mind as you're looking through some of these images that I share, you're not going to see hardly any of these homes or buildings on. I live in a home that's in a historic neighborhood in town that has a 40-foot wide lot. I have a house 10 foot on this side of me and a house 10 foot on this side of me. You won't see a photograph of any of these mid-century modern homes that don't have plenty of green space around them. So our diagram that we've shared with other presentations, where our pre-war, the United States used to have dense walkable communities. Now suburbanization and Goodyear selling tires and GM making cars and highways and everything became suburban, and now people were buying large lots to build homes on. And the other thing, and there's a book that really presents a strong argument for this, that the one thing that separates mid-century modern architecture from just modern architecture is glamour and marketing and sales, because there was a strong desire to, now we're talking about lifestyle, right? It was self-expression, it was lifestyle. And magazines were becoming more and more popular that were all selling not only the appliances and the teapots and the fabrics, but also homes. So this all led to those, to the development of mid-century modernism. And I would almost say in the United States, there was a sense, and we hear this name now, this term now, whether positively or negative, of this American exceptionalism, right? There was a lot of that going on, and a drive to say, we can do better than what we saw the Europeans doing with this international style. So this gentleman who also immigrated to the United States on the right, Mies van der Rohe, he was a Chicago architect, became a Chicago architect, designed a lot of very important modern skyscrapers in the United States, and was associated with IIT in Chicago, and was the designer for their campus, the master planner for their campus. This woman, I believe she was a gastroenterologist or a surgeon in Chicago. She was infatuated with him as a designer and happened to be in a dinner party with him one day. And you know, this is how we all, if we need to hire another architect, would you know anybody, you know, that would be perfect just like you, that would be willing to come work for us? Well, she's at a dinner party with me and says, would you know anybody that would be interested in designing an exceptional modern home? And of course he said, why, I'll be your guy. So you may have heard about the Farnsworth House before. Super monumental example of the evolution of this style in the United States, trying to strip all the decoration from the house. You can see the structural system is very simple. They have these I-beams supporting this ground plane, the ceiling plane, floor-to-ceiling glass, draperies that run around a track to give some privacy. And the floor plan, the bottom left rectangle, is an outdoor deck. You can see the heavier line around the upper right-hand image. The only enclosed rooms in this building are the mechanical room and the bathrooms. And they're using that element to help divide the spaces. So here you can see the privacy that's afforded with the kitchen on the other side of this wood wall to the living area and fireplace on the other side. You can't build this house on a 40-foot wide lot in downtown Fort Wayne and achieve the privacy that you're looking for. So the gentleman who designed this house, and by the way, they ended up in court. The house ended up being 10 times more expensive than he promised. It got real nasty before it was all said and done. Super important house. There was another art critic, architect, a gentleman named Philip Johnson in the United States. He did a lot of consultation for the Museum of Modern Art, put together modern art programs and architecture exhibits for them. These two weren't competing, but Philip Glass, these were happening at the same time, or I'm sorry, Philip Glass. Philip Johnson, wrong artist, were doing these about the same time, and I think he felt, I can do this better. He had this estate in New Canaan, Connecticut, and this is his example. And this would be tough to live in downtown Fort Wayne, right? The only enclosed space in this house is a small round bathroom that you see in that floor plan and a bank of cabinets that isolate it. But isn't that gorgeous? And the reason why I want to share this is I'm going to share a home with you very soon in Fort Wayne that is going to have a lot of similarities that many of you may not know about. Fast forward, and I hope I'm not going too fast with this. Remember Frank Lloyd Wright and the Kaufmans that owned this department store in downtown Pittsburgh? They wanted to move and have a seasonal house out in Palm Springs. Don't we all? And California was booming. This young architect that was once a protege for Frank Lloyd Wright, Richard Neutra, was now practicing. He designed that Lovell house that I shared with you. Kaufman leaves Frank Lloyd Wright and he pairs with Richard Neutra to design this home, which may be the most famous home in the United States when you talk about mid-century modern architecture. One of the things I'll share about this home, I mean, it's gorgeous. Imagine the mountains in the background. Again, you can't put this home on a 40-foot wide lot. Photographs of this style were becoming very popular, and I'll share some photographs soon with the photographer, Schulman. They were advertising lifestyle. I mean, look at these women of means. I mean, these people lived the good life, right? And that's part of what mid-century modern architecture was doing, is promoting the good life and a different way of living. And you know, it's funny, when I mentioned some of those pieces of furniture at the beginning of the presentation, this house looks like a showroom for Charles and Ray Eames, right? Every one of these pieces of furniture was designed by the Eames. And by the way, the Eames, it's interesting, during World War II, when there was a pause on a lot of this, they perfected the style of molding plywood, working for the government, creating splints, molding plywood splints for the people who, whatever was happening to them, the soldiers. So they perfected that for the government and turned that into processes where they made their chairs. So we talked a bit earlier about magazines and products and lifestyle. So this is a very famous image. There's this photographer, Julia Schulman, who photographed a lot of these homes in California. And this Arts and Architecture magazine, they started a program where they were, and I don't know the contractual relationship, but they were essentially hiring and instigating architects to design the best modern example that they could come up with, and they were promoting all these houses across the United States with a magazine. So everybody now could get a chance to exhibit or to review what mid-century design, or at that time it wasn't mid-century. The term mid-century modern, I don't think was ever used in any way until the mid-'80s. So this was something that really came about well after. But you look at this photograph and these lovely glamorous women, you know, posed, having their discussion. You see hints of this outside patio and this chaise lounge in the foreground. They are selling lifestyle. They are not selling architecture with this image. And so this happens to be Charles and Ray Eames, famous for their furniture design, that's sold through Herman Miller now, and always through Herman Miller. This was their home that was one of these case study homes that was designed. They were very into exploring the industrialization of a home and modular construction. The interesting thing about their house is the original design was a one-story house. They ordered all the materials, they changed their mind, and they incorporated all these into a two-story house to show you how modular and flexible these materials were. Another one is Schulman's photographs here. I mean, this says nothing about the architecture, and this says everything about the lifestyle. I mean, you can see hints of the architecture with steel construction, a steel ceiling plane, very minimalist, no adorned decoration. We talked about technology, so this is the stereotype of the man who had, you know, master of the technology in his house while the spouse was glamorously waiting for him to do whatever he's doing to this entertainment center. And you know that it has legs when many years later, before these two, Brad and Angelina, were married, W Magazine published a photo shoot of them that was somewhat of an homage to these original Schulman photographs. So here's the two of them posing in a home to try to mimic some of those old shots. The dirt on this image is when this was published in W Magazine, Brad had just been divorced from, I don't know, you all know more. Yes, thank you, Jennifer Aniston. She saw this and was surprised that they were a couple, which obviously they became a couple. So we're going to stay out in California before we come back to Northeast Indiana. There was a home builder named Eichler Homes. They were going all in on new modern architecture. And, you know, we call it mid-century modernism, but you could have equally back then called it an American modernism. which is what it was probably more importantly referred to back then. They were developing subdivisions, and not to dwell on these, but the catalog and the photos of some of the houses that they developed are really a catalog to help, or examples to say this is and isn't mid-century modernism, because everything about all these were just going all in on this idea of this new American style of modernism, this non-European style of modernism. And that's again where I think you can take the idea of glamour and merchandising and lifestyle. You never saw that in the European modernism, but boy, here in America, we went all out on that, for better or for worse. Again, always examples of something from Nelson or Saarinen or Eames or something in all of these different photographs. So these were all the homes they were building in California. Now, it's a little bit easier out there for a couple reasons. One is some of the wealth that was growing out there, and their weather is a little more predictable than our weather here. But these Eichler homes were just wonderful. And again, they are just poster children for this style of architecture. I think a lot of people in this room have probably heard of the name Oris Ish. He was an architect that designed several buildings in and around Fort Wayne. His office was here in Fort Wayne. He was, I believe, a Goshen College graduate or studied there at some point in his career, and he designed a lot of the buildings at Goshen College, which are really pretty special and still there if you get a chance going through Goshen. This was something that they found at the archives at Ball State. This was a promotional pamphlet that I believe Oris put together advertising his work. Oh, and let me go back to that. And these sketches, a couple of these sketches, the bottom one and the top one, you're going to see. I'm going to share images. So again, I grew up on the southeast side of Fort Wayne, and there was this strange building right across the street from McMillan Park that we said, that is the oddest looking building. I love it today. It is such an exceptional example of this style of architecture, and really goes head to head with a lot of these wonderful churches that were being designed by the Saarinens in Columbus, Indiana. This is really a special building, and these were some of the early photographs. Again, look at all of the Eames molded fiberglass furniture. How many of your churches that you attend look like this? Isn't this cool? You know, these chairs would go for a fortune today if they still, and maybe they still have some of the original ones there, but you can see the choir and whatever the clergy or whoever sat up front, they got the armchairs, the molded plywood armchairs, right? And then Oris designed a home for himself. I don't think the owner is here this morning. So we found some of these photos, and I was sharing a couple with her, and she just said, oh my goodness, I've never seen these before. And these came from the archives. But think back of the Farnsworth house, and think back of Philip Johnson's glass house, and compare it to what Oris Ish did. And I don't know the exact date of when he built this one. I'll flip back. This was a photograph of the front door. And the privacy that he achieved, it is literally a glass house, right? So you can see there's a fence that surrounded some of the property. This is a large property in southwest Fort Wayne. It's still there. It's gone through several ownerships. It's not in great shape right now, and the owner is trying to restore it back to the original metal cabinets and everything. So her heart is in the right place. This was the back of the house with the doors, and you can see the wood decks cantilevered. And again, think of that Johnson glass house, and think of the Edith Farnsworth house. Now this is a little different because he had a family, so he did the same thing where he enclosed just the bathrooms and the utility rooms in this home, but he had more practical needs, so he defined a few bedrooms off to the side of this thing. This house is gorgeous, and I would argue is the most pure example of mid-century modern architecture in Fort Wayne, or it rivals certainly the home that I shared up on the north side of our county. This is one of the early photographs of the exterior. Very simple, very clean. Oris had a relationship with an artist that was a professor at the University of Michigan, and he contracted with him to provide this painting, and the previous owner of the house still has this original painting. Look at that view from the outside at night. I mean, isn't that fantastic? You can see, like I mentioned the furniture before, you can see our George Nelson bench here in the foreground. All of these people designing and building and living in these homes all pick their furniture out of the same catalogs. It's hilarious. They just keep showing up and showing up and showing up. Off to the right is the kitchen and some open shelves in this home, and off the back were the bedrooms. This house, this is a privately owned house, so I didn't want to get too nosy. This is actually a very old photograph that, again, came out of the Ball State Archives. This is right across the street from the Oris East house I just shared. It's so simple. It's a brick facade, a recessed pair of doors. I think they're painted gold now, they're not orange. And it was just an open, you can see the dashed square skylights that run across the front of the house, and the back of the house all opens up to the wooded open lawn behind. Again, you can't build these houses on 40-foot wide lots. All of these are a product of suburban sprawl in this country, right? Which isn't necessarily a good thing, but for mid-century modern architecture it is. I'm not going to call this an example of mid-century modernism, but I think most of us are probably familiar with the Haynes House in Fort Wayne. The only true Frank Lloyd Wright designed house. One of the things I learned in preparing for this, the term Usonian, came from an early 20th century author who said that it was unfair to talk about our network of states as the United States of America. There's more than one America. There's North America, there's South America. So he presented this idea that we should refer to ourselves as U.S. own. You know, it's our own United States instead of saying of America. Rumor has it that's where Frank Lloyd Wright got the terminology for the Usonian home, from U.S. own, to present a style of architecture that he thought was affordable to everybody. That was his U.S. own product to sell to the country. Again, open style. Actually, the type of floor plan and the way it works is very similar to the Saarinen House in the northern part of Allen County. A lot of openness, a lot of daylight. But what was interesting to me about this, similar to what the Kaufmans did in Pennsylvania and later on in Palm Springs, the Haynes originally built that Usonian home, outgrew it, and built this roundhouse next door. This went on the market a couple years ago, and it sold before we had a chance to take a look at it. These photographs are off of the concrete company who did the polished concrete. But this was an Oris East house in Fort Wayne also. So it was interesting that the Haynes family were very large advocates of architecture and architects, and made some really solid choices. And boy, look at that. There's some mid-century modern chairs in that. I think I shared that there was one example in Fort Wayne that I was going to show with you that wasn't necessarily located on a third of an acre or more. And it's this house. And I don't have any interior photographs. This is a private residence on Edgewater, just north of the river. I won't get too specific with it. But it is a really strong example of mid-century modern architecture in Fort Wayne. And we're going to shift to another architect that designed some very meaningful buildings in our community. This was designed by Edwin Gibson. Last year, Connie, or maybe 2 years ago, Arch presented a program on Edwin Gibson, so I'm not going to get into that deeply. You can find, I do think you do have information on the website. Look at my time. Okay. And Wildwood Place, or Wildwood Park, is such an interesting suburban subdivision at that time that was developed. And what to me is so interesting is the span of design went across, I don't know, somebody in this room probably knows more, about 40 years of development from the north end to the south end. So what you see in Wildwood Park is this evolution of architectural styles from a lot of the classic revivalism at the north end getting into mid-century modernism down near the south end. So this is a home on South Washington, and is it Hawthorne? Beautiful example designed by Edwin Gibson. And this may be the last example that I'm going to share, and I'm not going to go so deeply into this, but this is such an important building, again, designed by Eero Saarinen. Again, the Cranbrook reference. God bless the seminary for bringing him into town, because this is a special building internationally, not just in Northeast Indiana. This is an original master plan model before computers. People had to build models of all these examples they wanted to show. So this was an original photo of a model out of the Cranbrook archives. And they also had a real fun image of this chapel, the Kramer Chapel, under construction. I thought that was so cool. Can you imagine being a worker working on the top of that thing? There's a lot of philosophy that connects the angles of the bricks and the slope, and there's more on that than I can explain today. That's a whole separate presentation. And you may have noticed, but some of the overview slides or the summary slides at the beginning are actually a photograph, an abstract photograph of those light wells that come in off the bottom of this. I had to show this building, and I'll tell you that this Hanselman house, designed by Michael Graves, I think it was one of his first commissions out of college. We learned about this house in our history books in college. This was an important building. This is, oh goodness, what's the Forest Ridge out southwest of Fort Wayne. There are all these suburban homes, and this is sitting out in the middle of it. And I tell a story, my wife will deny it, that one day we were looking for a house, so I thought I'd drive by, because I love this. Drive by and just see what she says. I'm not going to say a thing. And she says, oh my goodness, that's the ugliest house I've ever seen. And it just crushed me, because this house is so important. I would argue, I don't think it's probably mid-century modern architecture, but it was influenced so heavily. Michael Graves, you might know, really went deep into postmodernism, but there are a couple examples. I mean, these really connect more to a lot of the work nationally that people like Richard Meyer were doing elsewhere in the country. But these are really special examples, and you can find this home on websites from all around the world. This is a super special home in Fort Wayne. A lot of his early works, he created murals. He painted murals in the buildings. In fact, the Museum of Art, one of the things we did, there was an old medical practice on Berry Street, just immediately east of downtown, and it was an open plan, and all the exam rooms had a gigantic mural because Michael Graves designed it and painted all these exam room walls. And Charles and I went in there to try to figure out, can we take these down? Can we store them? Can we preserve them? And it logistically, just the answer became no, but we tried. But a lot of his homes had these photos. So there's a lot of mystery behind this house. This was also designed by Michael Graves. This, I believe, was his second house in Fort Wayne. Very different. This is the one Connie used for her image on the press release. I don't think it's mid-century modern, but it was so heavily influenced by mid-century modernism. There was a development going in that this land happened to sit on that property, and in that process, this home burned to the ground. It's never been classified as arson. But it's a shame that this home doesn't exist, because this Snyderman house, and I believe at the Snyderman house, the daughter, isn't that Nancy Snyderman, the one who used to be on NBC, or, you know, so they had very good taste. So I'm going to stop here temporarily, and I've got a lot more I can share, but I know we've got a time constraint. I think to review mid-century modernism, you have to think about the glamour and the advertising and the art. You can't look at it just as an example of architecture. They tend to be exhibited by things like clean lines. Obviously, as so much of modernism was a lack of decoration, these open flowing floor plans that might be divided just by elements rather than walls running to the ceiling. Everything has the furniture in it. As these are some of Mies's pieces of furniture that Philip Johnson put in his glass house. You'll see a lot of different types of construction, a lot of discussion about prefabrication, but they could never quite figure that out. But maybe the best example in the country, I think, was this house. So I can do a few things. I know this has been a long monologue so far. I can pause, and I can react to any kind of questions and be as helpful as I can. I can also show some other buildings in Fort Wayne that I think fall under this umbrella. So let me take a short break, and nobody says anything, I'll just jump right back in. First.
Are most of these slab construction?
You know, that's an interesting question, and the question was, are most of these homes slab construction? I don't know how the floor plan of the Edgewater house that Edwin Gibson designed is laid out. Everything else I can think of was a slab home, though. Yeah, I can't think of anything that had a basement. I'm sure that.
The one on North Washington Road had a basement.
Oh, did it? Okay. The South Washington house?
It's North Washington.
Okay.
The one next to the Frank Lloyd.
Oh, okay. Right, the roundhouse. Yeah.
The roundhouse has a basement.
My wife says, oh, yeah, I remember going to a party there in high school. Tom.
The other Gibson house that's at Hawthorne and South Washington, as I recall from some photos that were published when it was under construction, that it has like a concrete precast slab first floor over basement.
Over basement.
Yeah.
And there's a house right across the street that's very mid-century influence that has a lower level, because it's a very hilly, rolling, yeah.
I wanted to share the Hanselman house. Interestingly, I got exposed to that long before I moved to Fort Wayne because it was published in House Beautiful in probably the early mid-1970s. And it told the story about how the Hanselmans, she was friends with Michael Graves in college.
Right.
And that they wanted him to design a house for them. This was his first house design. And they pretty much built the thing themselves. Or he was
Did they?
contractor or actually hands-on with the construction of it.
And I would argue it's the best design. Being the first design out of college, I would argue it's his best building he'd ever designed. It's special nationally and internationally, not just here in Fort Wayne.
And then she owned a restaurant called New Jour in a building that's where the Tolan restaurant is now.
Okay.
Although the space was on the corner, and Michael Graves designed the interiors of that restaurant for her. And then with the Snydermans, Dr. Snyderman had offices at, I think it was Fairfield or Ewing.
It was one of those two in Barry, yeah.
He had his ENT office.
Very traditional building, but you walked inside and they had a very modern layout,
And
yeah.
actually, the interior was very much like this in that it was
Yep.
all
Mhm.
exposed industrial structure and very modern interior.
No ceilings in the exam bays. You couldn't do it today with HIPAA violations. Yeah. I saw a couple other hands go up. Yes, ma'am.
I went through the Eshelman house, I think 5 years ago when it was on the market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it sold in the low 200s. I was wondering, did it sell to a family that really appreciated or understood?
I think the person who, which one, the Snyderman or the Hanselman house? I don't know the person. I believe he's somebody that works here in town out at Sweetwater. He uses it as an Airbnb. And I think his goal is to present it as a wonderful work of architecture. So I do think he has an appreciation for it.
Because I don't think it was listed internationally or nationally for people who might really want value and stuff.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because it had been on the market for a long time. And I remember thinking, okay, we're going to move. I'm going to buy that house. And it had sold like a week before. And it needed a lot of work. it needed a lot of work, but it was still there. It was all still there. What other questions or comments? Yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the difference between modular house
Mhm.
and slab. Is that the same?
Modular tends to be a description, I guess I threw out, that tends to describe a lot of prefabricated pieces and parts.
And is that
That can be a-
is that generally a key factor in the mid-century?
I don't know if it's, I know it was a focus in a lot of the California, especially those Eichler homes, as they were looking at how can we incorporate manufacturing processes to make these more efficient and cost effective. And so I think,
Depreciate, that's what
oh,
that's what I heard, never invest in a modular home because you won't be able to sell it.
that's so interesting. Yeah, no, I don't know. I can keep showing you other images, things you may agree with and things you may not with. I know it's already 5 till 2, so if you need to leave, leave. But I'm just going to show a few more. So we talked about those buildings on South Washington. This isn't a real glamorous development. These are the Wildwood Place apartments. But how can you look at these and compare them to those Eichler homes and say that's not a great example of mid-century modern design in Fort Wayne? So this is interesting. These have more recently been Chinese restaurants. There was one on, is it Fairfield? There was one out on North Anthony, and there was another one somewhere in town. There were 3 of them. These photos, interestingly, we talked about the Nelson bench. Let me drive you crazy here for a second. If you don't know what a Nelson bench, everybody probably knows what a Nelson bench is. That bench in the lower left, you've seen them. I've got one in my house. I mean, we have one in our office. That's a Nelson bench. George Nelson, who is one of the Cranbrook artists and furniture makers that came out of Cranbrook. Is anybody here from Grinsfelder's office that may know more about this? This was designed by George Nelson, the same person that designed that Nelson bench, and another architect in New York. And Alan Grinsfelder, I believe, was the local architect in charge of this. In fact, these images came from a brochure that was the American Institute of Architects New York State Annual Awards brochure. So this back in, it was the early 70s, I think this was awarded an AIA New York. So let me go back. So this is People's Trust Bank. You know, they don't exist as far as I know anymore. They also had this. I'm guessing that Nelson had something to do with this building. This is out on Coliseum Boulevard. It doesn't exist. I have random memories of this from being a kid, but how can you look at this? And I didn't get in, I could have gone down another path here and gotten into Aero Saranen and GM headquarters and TWA and the St. Louis Arch and all of these things and on and on and on and on. If you're familiar with any of those buildings that Saranen did, how can you look at this and separate it from that style of architecture? I think that is so cool. A lot of people remember this house. This went up on the market maybe a year or 2 ago. Jim Sherbundi, he's a local architect. I assume he's still around. He doesn't practice. I don't know. Does anybody know Jim here in the room? Connie does. They sold this house, and whoever marketed it for him did a wonderful job selling the 70s and the spirit of this house. And it still looked like this when he sold it. And this may have come from a real estate listing. This is a building, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Southwood Park. Woodhurst. Thank you, Woodhurst. This is one of these buildings that keeps me up at night. An architect that died a few years ago named Ken Cole designed this thing. This is the coolest building that so centers on that style of design. And they came to me and said, we want to add this big classroom addition onto it. And I did it, but the building is so much worse off today than it was when it was just this lyrical building sitting in the middle of nowhere. And the way I should have shown another image of this. If you know this building, it has these swoopy, curvy roofs, but they are all made out of straight 2-bys that just rotated and created this arcing pattern. it was just such a cool building, such a cool building. I wish we had never added on to it. It's so cool. If you want to venture outside of Fort Wayne, and this is something that is an interest to you, obviously Columbus, Indiana is a mecca for this style of architecture. This is the Miller House, which is now somewhat of a museum. I can't recall if the city owns this or the Indianapolis Museum of Art's connected to this.
Indianapolis Museum of Art.
Yeah. This place is everything mid-century modern on an enormous scale. I think Dan Kiley was the landscape architect. I mean, this checks every box you can check. It's fabulous. As well as so many of the architectural styles that Columbus, Indiana has done a wonderful job, from Eliel Saarinen, think back of the first president of Cranbrook, to his son, Eero Saarinen, who designed this first Christian church. And if you've never been in here, I mean, this is on every architecture student's tour, you know. What a great church. Now look at this building and think about that Orsish building on McKinney and Hessen-Kassel. There's so much in common, and they're both such strong buildings. Now here's a last parting shot. I mean, I know I've taken far too much of your time this morning. I could too, and that's the problem. Remember when I talked about the international style in Europe? So then all this happened, Cranbrook, the West Coast, World War II, and America, I think through this sense of this American exceptionalism, said we can do better. We want to define a modernism that is ours, that is very separate. And if you know the work of Saarinen and you think about some of those others, that very first architect that I shared with you, Corbu, who was a master of the international style, very hard, very buildings that lack personality, right? Very industrial type personalities. I would argue that if it wasn't for the designs being done in Indiana, he would have never evolved to design my favorite building in the world, which is this chapel outside of Ronchamp, France. And if you think about his industrial international style buildings, he would have never have done this if you put him in an international style box. And the interior of this building, this was on the battleground of this ancient battle. And all of the openings and the fenestration resembled all the cannon fire that blew holes in the original church that sat on this. And even the floor plan of this building, which is a very open, they have an inside and an outside chapel. I don't think this would have ever happened without the influence. So Europe influenced the United States. Cranbrook in southeastern Michigan, the whole LA, greater Palm Springs area, really built this message of mid-century modern architecture, which is all ours. It is a very United States branded and very capitalistic movement that I will argue went out and started to influence others in the world. That's my presentation. I'm happy to respond to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go,
Ask questions.
please.
Keep them here, reasonable amount of time.
I just looked it up, and I think it's two homes side by side on Sanibel. It's just east of the student housing at University, PFW.
Okay.
And are you aware of those homes? There's a lot of stone in there.
I'm not familiar with those.
And they have like an upper runway to go to all the bedrooms. It's a spectacular house, and I just think it's off the radar. And I just was wondering if you would.
No, thank you for sharing. I'm not familiar with those. There are so many homes around. There was one in town. I didn't include this because I didn't feel like I had as much information on, is it Lake Avenue? A couple blocks on this side of the Macomb Funeral Home that was designed by, I talked to Doug McComb about this a couple weeks ago, by his dad for his dad. And it's this wonderful, Krager and I were talking about the other day, trying to dig into this. It's this just wonderful limestone, flat-roofed house with this central pyramid skylight in the middle that I think is a fabulous example of this style of architecture. There might be one, and I'm going to hide my eyes from Don and Krager when I say this so I don't catch the scornful looks. There's a 3-story house a block and a half down the street from me on Wayne Street that faces the river that I would argue has a lot of strong mid-century modern influences to it. So they're everywhere, and it's hard to put them in that 1945 to 1975 box that the internet would lead you to believe.
We love mid-century modern, and our house is that way, and we have that kind of furniture. But if you think about it, as wonderful, as sculptural as the homes are, and the furniture is, you don't see any fine art there. You don't see paintings, you don't see sculpture.
And that's one of the things I loved about that Oris Ish, the house he designed for himself over on Oak Lane. He commissioned this huge painting to fit that space. If you look at his front yard, he commissioned sculpture. I mean, so he was immersed in the arts. And really, mid-century modernism isn't, as you described, just architecture. It's almost more paintings and fabrics and objects and furniture, for goodness sake. And again, I would still argue with Connie that if it weren't for Florence Knoll, and if it weren't for Knoll Furniture, and if it weren't for Herman Miller, I don't know if we would have ever described a mid-century modern. There are a lot of the Miami Beach resort hotels that were designed around this time that can fall into that, but that's a different style of mid-century design than we see here or they saw out in California.
Well, and I think when you want to look at the decorative, the arts in the mid-century houses, you got to look at that pottery.
Right.
There's some pottery and glassware that's very important, tucked away in some of these.
And I would argue the furniture is art. I mean, furniture used to be heavy and sit on the ground, but all of these examples of mid-century furniture are all elevated. I mean, they're works of art in themselves, and they were designed by artists. I mean, it's, in a way, that's the art in some of these homes. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned some of the real well-known furniture makers. Where does Dunbar from Burton fit in that?
Oh, they were an enormous mid-century influence. Dunbar, the question was, where does Dunbar Furniture, which went out of business, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, in Bern, where do they fit in? My understanding of it, they made some beautiful mid-century modern furniture that very few people in the Midwest appreciated. Their biggest market was New York City.
They have a famous designer who worked for them.
Yeah. And they did a lot of work for Graves.
Did they? No? No, they have some fabulous furniture that they did. Tom, you had your hand up.
I was going to say, talking about this integration of art and architecture and houses, Frank Lloyd Wright was doing that in the beginning of the 20th century. 50 years before all this mid-century modernism was trying to do this kind of same thing, but he was doing it for a very, very small, select clientele, but very much incorporated into the architecture these works of other fine artists and furniture as well.
And with Tom's comment about Frank Lloyd Wright's floor plans, right? If you look at the Wermuth house that Iliel and Eero Saarinen designed in northern Allen County, and you look at the Haynes house on North Washington, there's a lot of similarities in those open, flowing layouts.
I would like to argue that Wright was doing in America what the Bauhaus were trying to do in Europe, which is kind of dismantle the idea of buildings as strings of boxes tied together with holes punched in the sides, but rather the spaces that flow from one to another and between indoors and outdoors, and a much more fluid approach to spatial organization.
I agree. Are there any other comments or questions? This is certainly not all-inclusive, as you know.
What do you think led to the end of the style in particular?
You know, I would be crass and say postmodernism was the death of all architecture, which was sort of that next phase which Michael Graves was a giant in postmodern architecture. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Because I just adore this style of architecture. Love it. I don't know. That's because I think what followed wasn't as good. So-
I would argue it was a big pendulum swing toward traditionalism.
It was. You're right.
And probably around the Reagan era, you didn't see this very highly progressive lifestyle that modernism expressed. And at the same time, modernism and brutalism toward the end of it was creating buildings that were not very pleasant for people to experience. And so people like Philip Johnson designed a skyscraper with a Chippendale bonnet on the top of it in
In New York City. Yeah.
But I think there was a big pendulum swing that we still haven't gotten fully away from, because farmhouse modern is what we call modern today, and it's not modern at all.
And it should be noted,
Country traditional, I think there's just been a huge pendulum swing in the late 20th century and into the 21st.
some of these examples of exceptional architecture, like the Nutra Palm Springs house, which is the poster child of mid-century modern, or Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, or the Edith Farnsworth house done about an hour outside of Chicago. These homes were all promised as opportunities for the future of construction. They all came in 10 times over their budget. That didn't help.
Do you know why that was? 'Cause they seemed simple-ish material. Was it the shape of things, the labor?
There's probably some ego involved with the architects. I don't know. That's a really good question. You're right. They're so simple. You could say, well, why? It'd be interesting to know Oris Isha's home, the one with the glass box and the white columns. It'd be interesting to know how much that costs compared to other homes, because it feels simple. And I would guess that he would have more humility regarding a budget than people like Mies van der Rohe or Frank Lloyd Wright or Richard Nutra might have had.
Well, it may just be the simple fact that we've had centuries of experience building with wood and brick and concrete and trying to get large panes of glass and steel bars and concrete to fit together and not leak and to be airtight and to have sliding glass panes and all these other new things work as well as these centuries tested other building techniques. Could be a longevity problem. I knew Lois Hanselman, and I knew the challenges of living in that house and keeping it up. And it was made out of plywood.
It was, the outside of it was starting to fall apart.
That's an issue.
Yeah.
Right, and so it's a whole new technology of building houses. It's a whole new set of expectations for the people who live in there for how the house works. And, it's new stuff to learn, new technologies, building technologies to master. And we haven't had centuries of learning how to do it like we have with wood and brick and stone.
Well, this was so much fun. Thank you for letting me go on a monologue and lecture you about architectural style. I don't think that's what you were expecting coming in here, but I think it's important to know, to help understand what it is rather than to say this is in the box, because that's just not how the real world works. So you've been so nice, and we appreciate all the comments and thoughts. Thank you.